On a Tuesday morning in June of 1989, during a routine training exercise at Fort Hood, Texas, the ground opened up and swallowed a 70-ton M1 Abrams main battle tank. It happened at 09:47 hours on Range 12, a section of the base where armored units practiced maneuvers in terrain that simulated Middle Eastern conditions. The tank was part of a 4-vehicle platoon conducting movement drills when the driver reported unusual vibrations through the tracks. 5 seconds later, the earth collapsed. The Abrams dropped 15 feet straight down into a limestone cavern that had been eroding beneath the surface for thousands of years. The tank's weight, 70 tons of composite armor, turbine engine, and 120 main gun, punched through the weakened crust like a fist through cardboard. The 4-man crew got out, shaken, bruised, but alive. They climbed out of the turret and scrambled up the crumbling walls of the sinkhole while their tank settled at a 40-degree angle in the cavity below. By 11:00 hours, Fort Hood's commanding officer, Colonel James Rutledge, stood at the edge of the hole with the Army Corps of Engineers and looked at a problem that shouldn't exist. The M1 Abrams was the most advanced battle tank in the world. It cost $4.3 million, and it was sitting in a hole that was getting wider every time someone walked near the edge. Assessment, Colonel Rutledge said. The lead engineer, a captain named David Carson, consulted his tablet computer and geological survey data. The cavity is approximately 25 feet in diameter and extends at least 30 feet deep. The collapse was caused by subsurface limestone dissolution, basically an underground cave system that we didn't know existed. The hole is still unstable. We're detecting active subsidence. Can we pull the tank out? Not safely, sir. The geology is too unstable to support heavy recovery equipment. Any attempt to position a crane or heavy wrecker near the edge could trigger a secondary collapse. We could lose the recovery vehicle and potentially personnel. So what are our options? Carson looked at his data again. We seal the cavity with concrete, write off the tank, and order a replacement. Recovery costs would exceed the value of the asset, and the risk to personnel is unacceptable. Colonel Rutledge stared at the tank, at $4.3 million of American military hardware sitting in Texas limestone. Do it, he said. Tag it as total loss. Get the paperwork started. That's when a 1950 Ward LaFrance wrecker pulled up to the base gate. Let me tell you about Hank Morrison, because you need to understand the man before you understand what he did. Henry Bulldog Morrison was 74 years old in 1989. He'd been born in Killeen, Texas, in 1915, the son of a ranch hand who'd worked cattle drives before the automobile made cowboys obsolete. Hank had enlisted in the Army in 1950 when he was 35 years old and the Korean War was just beginning. Too old for combat infantry, they'd told him. But the Army needed combat engineers, men who could build bridges under fire, clear mines, and recover damaged vehicles from impossible terrain. Hank had spent 3 years in Korea with the 8th Engineer Combat Battalion. He'd learned tank recovery from men who'd done the same job in World War II, pulling Sherman tanks out of French hedgerows and German mud. He'd learned to work under artillery fire, to rig cables in the dark, to understand weight distribution and leverage when your life depended on getting it right the first time. He'd earned a Bronze Star in 1953 for recovering 3 damaged tanks from behind enemy lines during a night operation that was never fully documented in official records. After the war, Hank came back to Killeen, which by then had grown into the town that serviced Fort Hood, and started a recovery business. He bought surplus military equipment at auction, including a 1950 Ward LaFrance Model 500 wrecker that had been used by the Army during the Korean War and was being sold off as outdated. Hank had been running Morrison Heavy Recovery for 36 years. He'd pulled everything from tractors to bulldozers out of Texas mud. He'd worked highway accidents, construction sites, and ranch emergencies. And every few years, When Fort Hood had a recovery job that their modern equipment couldn't handle, they called Hank. On that Tuesday morning, Hank heard about the sinkhole on his police scanner, heard the Army engineers discussing geological instability and acceptable losses, heard Colonel Rutledge authorize writing off a $4.3 million tank. Hank put on his work shirt, started the Ward LaFrance. It fired on the first try, like always, and drove to Fort Hood's main gate. The MPs at the gate knew him. Hank had been coming to this base longer than most of them had been alive. "Morning, Bulldog," the sergeant said. "What brings you out?" "Heard you boys dropped a tank in a hole," Hank said. "Thought I might be able to help." The sergeant made a phone call. 10 minutes later, Hank was escorted to Range 12, where Colonel Rutledge and Captain Carson were still standing at the edge of the sinkhole. Hank climbed out of the Ward LaFrance slowly. 74-year-old joints don't move fast, and walked over. "Colonel," Hank said, offering a hand. Rutledge shook it. "Hank Morrison, been a while." "Yes, sir, heard you got a recovery problem." Rutledge looked at the sinkhole. "We've got a $4 million problem that the engineers say can't be solved." "I'd like to take a look." Carson stepped forward. "Sir, with respect, this is an active geological hazard. We can't allow civilian personnel near the edge." "Captain Carson, this is Hank Morrison," Rutledge said. "He's pulled more equipment out of impossible situations than you've seen in your career. If he wants to look, he can look." Hank walked to the edge of the sinkhole and spent 10 minutes studying it. He looked at the tank's position, the angle of the tilt, the stability of the surrounding limestone. He picked up a rock and dropped it, watching how it fell, listening to how it sounded when it hit bottom. Then he walked back to Rutledge. "I can pull it out," Hank said. Carson actually laughed. "Sir, that tank weighs 70 tons. The ground is unstable. We can't get a crane within 50 feet of the edge. And you think he looked at the Ward LaFrance, a truck from 1950, can do what our modern equipment can't." "Yes," Hank said simply. "Based on what analysis?" "Based on pulling tanks out of worse situations in Korea in 1951. Carson's expression shifted from amusement to something closer to offense. "With respect, this is a modern M1 Abrams, not a Korean War era." "Weight is weight," Hank interrupted quietly. "Doesn't matter if it's a Sherman, a Patton, or an Abrams. The principles are the same: leverage, rigging points, and understanding geology well enough to know where to position your anchor." Colonel Rutledge looked at Hank for a long moment. "If we authorize this, and something goes wrong, then you write off a truck from 1950 instead of a tank from 1989, Hank said. "I'm not asking the Army to take responsibility. I'm asking permission to try." Rutledge looked at Carson. "Your professional opinion." "It won't work, sir. The geology alone makes it impossible." Rutledge looked back at Hank. "Your professional opinion." "It'll work." Rutledge made his decision. "You've got 4 hours, Hank. After that, we start pouring concrete." Hank nodded once. "I'll need 2 hours. Let me tell you about the 1950 Ward LaFrance Model 500, because understanding the machine is the only way to understand what Hank did next. The Ward LaFrance Model 500 was built in Elmira, New York in 1950 for U.S. military service. It was designed for combat recovery operations, pulling damaged vehicles out of hostile territory where modern conveniences like paved roads and stable ground didn't exist. It had a straight-six gasoline engine that produced about 140 horsepower, not impressive by modern standards, but the Model 500 wasn't built for speed, it was built for pulling. The boom was constructed from military-grade steel I-beams, reinforced at every joint, designed to handle side loads and unstable rigging angles. The winch was mechanically driven through a power takeoff system with an 8-stage planetary gear reduction that multiplied pulling force by a factor of 20. No hydraulics to leak, no computers to fail, just steel cable, cast iron gears, and a hand clutch that let the operator feel every pound of resistance through the controls. The truck had been modified for combat conditions: extra fuel capacity, heavy-duty suspension, a reinforced frame designed to handle recall forces that would bend civilian equipment. Hank had maintained that truck for 36 years. He knew every bolt, every system, every modification that had been made during its military service and after. He positioned the Ward LaFrance about 40 feet from the sinkhole edge, on ground he'd tested by walking it, feeling for the solid limestone beneath the topsail. Then he began his setup. First, the anchors. Hank pulled 4 military surplus ground anchors from the truck bed, steel stakes 4 feet long with screw threads cut into them. He drove them into the Texas hardpan using a post driver, spacing them in a wide rectangle behind the truck. These weren't safety measures, they were physics. When the tank came up, it would try to pull the Ward LaFrance backward into the sinkhole. The anchors would transfer that force directly into the bedrock. Next, he ran heavy chains from the anchors to reinforced points on the truck's frame. The chains weren't taut, they had slack. They'd only engage when the pulling force exceeded the truck's weight. Then Hank extended the boom manually, hand cranking it upward with the same ratchet mechanism he'd used 1,000 times. When it was fully extended, he locked it with a pin the size of his thumb. The Army personnel watched in silence. Some were skeptical, others were curious. Carson was taking notes, probably for the report he'd write later about why this had failed. Hank rigged his cable system carefully. He ran the main cable from the winch drum through a series of snatch blocks positioned at calculated points between the truck and the sinkhole. Each block redirected the pulling force and multiplied it through mechanical advantage. Then came the dangerous part. Hank climbed down into the sinkhole. "Mr. Morrison," Carson shouted, "that's not safe." Hank didn't respond. He worked his way down the crumbling limestone wall, testing each foothold until he reached the bottom. The M1 Abrams sat at a 40-degree angle, its left track buried in collapsed limestone, its right track pointing at the sky. Hank spent 15 minutes examining the tank's undercarriage, looking for the right attachment point. He found what he needed, a tow shackle designed for exactly this kind of recovery, built into the tank's frame. He connected his cable with 2 heavy-duty shackles, tested the connection with his weight, and climbed back out. By the time he reached the surface, he was breathing hard and covered in limestone dust. "You all right?" Rattledge asked. "Fine," Hank said. "Did this kind of thing under mortar fire. Peacetime geology's easy." He walked back to the Ward LaFrance, climbed into the cab, and started the winch. The sound was different from modern hydraulic systems, deeper, more mechanical. The planetary gears engaged with a series of metallic clicks that echoed across the range. The cable went taut. The snatch blocks took the load. The Ward LaFrance's frame settled onto its suspension with a groan. For 45 seconds, nothing visible happened. The Army personnel watched. Some held their breath. Carson was writing furiously. Then the M1 Abrams moved. Not much, an inch, maybe 2, but 70 tons of main battle tank shifted position inside the sinkhole. "It's working," someone whispered. The tank began to tilt. The left track, buried in limestone, started to lift. The right track, pointing at the sky, started to lower. Hank kept the winch turning, steady, patient, the same way he'd pulled tanks in Korea when enemy artillery was falling and speed got you killed. 3 inches, 6 inches. The Abrams was rotating now, coming level. The tracks were finding purchase on solid limestone at the bottom of the cavity. 1 foot, 2 feet. The tank was moving horizontally now, sliding across the sinkhole floor toward the ramp that Hank had identified during his initial assessment, a natural slope in the limestone that the tank could climb if it had momentum. Hank stopped the winch, repositioned, started again. The second pull was harder. The tank was climbing now, fighting gravity and friction simultaneously. The Ward LaFrance's engine note changed as the load increased. The boom flexed slightly, not bending, just responding to forces it was designed to handle. The anchor chains went taut with a sound like rifle shots. 5 feet, 10 feet. The Abrams was halfway up the slope. Hank stopped again, repositioned again. By now the Army personnel understood what they were watching. This wasn't one heroic pull. This was systematic combat engineering. Break the problem into steps, solve each step, advance. The third pull brought the Abrams to the edge of the sinkhole. The fourth pull brought it onto solid ground. When the tank's rear track cleared the edge and rolled onto level earth, the Army personnel didn't cheer. They stood in stunned silence. A 74-year-old man with a 39-year-old truck had just recovered a $4.3 million tank that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had declared unrecoverable. Hank shut down the winch, set the brake, and climbed out of the Ward LaFrance. He began coiling his cable without ceremony. Colonel Rutledge walked over. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised everyone, including Hank. He saluted. Hank straightened, 74 years old but military bearing still intact, and returned the salute with Korean War precision. "Combat engineers, sir," Hank said quietly. "We don't leave equipment behind." "What do we owe you?" Rutledge asked. "Nothing, Colonel. Did it for the same reason I did it in Korea. Some things are worth pulling out, even when people say they're not." "There's got to be something." Hank thought for a moment. Fort Hood Museum. They're trying to restore a Korean War-era recovery vehicle. Donate whatever you think is fair. Rutledge made a call. Within an hour, Fort Hood's accounting office had authorized a $25,000 donation to the museum in Hank Morrison's name. Hank nodded, climbed into the Ward LaFrance, and drove toward the gate. As the old wrecker disappeared down the range road, Captain Carson stood with his tablet, looking at data that didn't match the result. "That shouldn't have worked," Carson said. "The ground loading alone should have caused secondary collapse. The rigging angles violated standard engineering safety factors." "But it did work," Rutledge interrupted quietly. "And that's the difference between engineering theory and combat engineering practice." But the story doesn't end there. Let me tell you what happened 8 weeks later, because that's when Hank made the discovery that changed everything. The Ward LaFrance had been running rough since the Fort Hood recovery. Nothing critical, just a vibration in the boom that Hank couldn't identify. He suspected a stress crack somewhere in the frame. Pulling 70 tons would stress any structure, even military-grade steel. He pulled the truck into his shop, a metal building on the outskirts of Killeen that he'd built in 1955, and began a complete structural inspection. The Ward LaFrance's frame was reinforced military construction, heavy steel rails with crossmembers every 18 inches. Hank had inspected it hundreds of times, but this time he was looking for hairline cracks, so he was being more thorough. He was underneath the truck, flashlight in hand, when he noticed something unusual. One section of the frame rail sounded hollow when he tapped it, different from the rest. He measured it. The outside dimensions matched the rest of the frame, but when he drilled a small inspection hole, the wall thickness was different. Someone had modified this section, cut out the original rail, and welded in a replacement with a hollow core. Hank spent the next 2 hours carefully cutting through the welds. When the section finally came free, he found a sealed military ammunition canister inside the frame rail. His hands were shaking as he opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with military-grade wax. A Bronze Star medal in its presentation case. The citation read, "For meritorious achievement in ground operations against an armed enemy during the period 1522–March 1953. The recipient, Corporal Henry Morrison, 8th Engineer Combat Battalion." But there was a notation Hank had never seen. Classified operations, details restricted. 12 pages of declassified CIA documents dated 1953-1968, stamped confidential, and later DCLASSFID 1988. The documents described covert equipment recovery operations conducted behind enemy lines during the Korean War armistice negotiations. 3 hand-drawn maps on military survey paper showing North Korean tunnel systems, equipment staging areas, and cross-border routes. The maps were annotated in English and Korean, marked intelligence use only. $11,400 in U.S. military scrip and Korean currency from the 1950s. And a letter typed on U.S. Army stationery dated April 1953. CPL Morrison, your participation in Operation Timber Wolf remains classified at the highest level. The equipment recovery missions you conducted March 1522 were essential to intelligence gathering efforts and are not to be discussed with any personnel, including family. This vehicle has been prepared for civilian auction and modified to secure materials related to these operations. Should you acquire this vehicle through surplus channels, these materials are yours to retain or destroy at your discretion. Your service to intelligence operations is noted in your classified personnel file. LTC J. Hammond, G2 Intelligence Section, 8th Army. Hank sat in his shop, holding a Bronze Star he'd earned but never received, reading about operations he'd conducted but never been allowed to discuss. Operation Timber Wolf, March 1953. Hank remembered it now, 3 nights of crossing into North Korean territory to recover abandoned Soviet equipment, tanks, trucks, radios, equipment that U.S. intelligence wanted to examine but couldn't officially acknowledge acquiring. Hank and his crew had pulled the vehicles out under cover of darkness, delivered them to intelligence officers who asked no questions and gave no thanks, and returned to normal duties as if it had never happened. The Bronze Star had been awarded in a classified ceremony. The citation had been filed in records Hank couldn't access, and when the Ward LaFrance had been surplused in 1954, someone in intelligence had hidden the evidence inside it, knowing that Hank, one of the few people who might buy a Korean War-era wrecker at auction, would eventually find it. Let me tell you what Hank did with that discovery. He kept the Bronze Star, mounted it in a frame on his shop wall next to his Korean War service photo. The CIA documents he donated to the National Archives, where they became part of the historical record of Cold War intelligence operations. The maps he gave to the Army Heritage and Education Center, where they helped historians understand covert operations during the Korean War armistice period. The currency, Hank used it to establish a scholarship fund at Central Texas College for children of combat engineers studying skilled trades. I got paid once for that work, Hank told the scholarship committee. Turned out to be 40 years late, but it showed up. Seems right to pass it forward. The Ward LaFrance stayed in Hank's shop. He drove it for another 6 years, until 1995, when he was 80 years old, and his doctor told him he was too old to be climbing under 70-ton tanks. Truck still runs, Hank said. That's not the point, his son said. Hank looked at the Ward LaFrance, sitting in the shop where it had sat for 41 years. Dark red military surplus paint, white lettering, the boom that had pulled tanks in Korea and Texas. All right, he said, but it doesn't get scrapped. Fort Hood took it. They restored it carefully, keeping all of Hank's modifications intact, and placed it at the entrance to the base museum. The plaque reads, 1950 Ward LaFrance Model 500 Wrecker. Operator Henry Bulldog Morrison, 1950 41995. This vehicle served in Korea 1951-953, conducted classified intelligence recovery operations 1953, and recovered an M1 Abrams tank at Fort Hood in 1989 that Army engineers declared unrecoverable. Combat engineering, we don't leave equipment behind. Henry Morrison died in 1997 at the age of 82. His funeral was held with full military honors at the Fort Hood Cemetery. Colonel Rutledge, retired by then, gave the eulogy. "Hank Morrison taught the United States Army something we'd forgotten," Rutledge said. "He taught us that some knowledge can't be found in manuals or computer models. It can only be earned in places where mistakes mean death and success means bringing everyone home." He pulled tanks in Korea when he was 35. He pulled a tank at Fort Hood when he was 74. And the principles were exactly the same. Understand the weight, respect the geology, and never quit until the mission is complete. The 1950 Ward LaFrance still sits at Fort Hood's museum entrance. Next to it is Hank's Bronze Star, the declassified CIA documents, and a photograph of the M1 Abrams recovery in 1989. Every June, on the anniversary of the sinkhole recovery, someone from the 8th Engineer Battalion visits the museum and leaves a combat engineer insignia on the truck's running board. A reminder that some problems can't be solved with modern equipment and computer analysis. That some knowledge can only be learned under fire, where theory meets reality and reality doesn't care about your safety margins. And that sometimes, when the Army says nothing can pull it out, all you need is an old combat engineer who remembers when impossible meant try harder. The Army said nothing could pull it out. The old man fired up his 1950 Ward LaFrance and proved that combat engineers don't leave equipment behind. Not in Korea, not in Texas, not ever.